Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, Anticipating 2050, Acting Today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. And real quick, before we get to today's episode, just want to let you all know that we'd really appreciate if you could give us a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to this, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you might be finding it. This rating and review really help other people find out about the podcast and the incredible guests that we have. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Amanda Eaken, the Director for Transportation and Climate in the Healthy People and Thriving Communities program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. How are you doing today, Amanda?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Of course. It's my pleasure. I have the utmost respect for your organization, and I'm looking forward to digging into some of these questions here with you today. And I wonder if we could kind of start off with maybe if you could define how you perceive what you guys do or what your particular role is in creating thriving communities, as you put it.
Yeah, I would say what we're trying to do is find the policy solutions that not only address our climate challenges, but also make our communities healthier, stronger, and more resilient. And in our program, I think we're bringing a new focus to putting people at the center of our work, which maybe hasn't always been the case in the environmental community.
That is interesting because it does seem to represent a shift. There's always been this divide in some environmental fields between this kind of natural world that's held apart from humans and then the human world, which is considered perverse or polluted or however you want to define it. But you guys are trying to break that down, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think there was maybe a time in our history where we thought cities were sort of centers of pollution, and that that living in other ways was more environmentally friendly, living closer to nature. And more and more data and analysis are showing that actually cities are some of the greenest places we can live. Because in cities, we don't need to drive as much, or sometimes we don't need to drive at all. If we can walk and use transit and biking to access our daily needs, we tend to live in units that are more energy efficient. And there's been a lot of comparison about the average kind of carbon footprint of an urban dweller versus somebody who lives in a more auto-oriented location. And it turns out that cities really have the lowest carbon footprint per person of any kind of land use situation we've developed. So I think there's a new focus on cities as a part of the environmental solution.
Do you think that are we even beginning to see cities lead in that movement in some ways?
I think we are seeing a lot of cities leading, and we're going to need cities to step up with even more ambitious climate actions if we're going to reach our goal. It was, of course, for all of us, an absolutely devastating moment last June when President Trump announced that he would be pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. But almost immediately, we saw a groundswell of support from cities, from individuals, from companies standing up to say, we are still in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we're going to lead. And that's been part of the work that we've been looking at NRDC. What would it actually take for a city to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement? What kinds of actions would we need to put in place to achieve those ambitious carbon goals by 2025? And so we're wanting to partner with more and more cities to put in place those ambitious climate actions that not only, reach the Paris Climate Agreement, but can make their cities stronger, healthier, more wonderful, more vibrant, thriving places.
Is that, these, obviously there's a reason that companies and individuals and such can say, we're going to stick to these commitments. And cities are still political units in some ways. So how is it that they're able to kind of lead in this when we see federal and even state level governments struggling to figure out how to create a shared vision or how to enact environmental policy?
Yeah, I think it's because mayors at the local level just can understand very intuitively that the same kinds of actions that will reduce their greenhouse gas emissions will also make their cities more healthy, more vibrant places. So take an example of just city streets. It's one of the assets that cities maintain and have jurisdiction over. Do we want to have streets that are pleasant places, that are comfortable for walking and cycling, that are really places? Or do we want to have streets that are just thoroughfares for more vehicles to travel through and emit environmental pollution? Of course, we're going to want to create places that are safe for walking, that are pleasant, that are safe for cycling. Those create greater property values. Those are the places that we want to be. That's good for the economy. That's good for businesses. And so it's those kinds of decisions, just taking that very basic example of our city streets, where the decision to make streets safer for walking and cycling helps to promote a low carbon travel mode, but it also just makes the street a better place. And people are really drawn to that.
Well, I'm intrigued kind of, there's this image, 20, 30 years ago of these cities as these places that are godforsaken, barren lands where nothing but violence and crime and dirt and grime in these places. And we've now seen that image is totally shifted. I wonder if you could, if there's anything that you kind of attribute that to, that why is it that we're now viewing cities in slightly a different way?
Well, I think if you look at the history of cities, really for hundreds of years, cities were focused around people. They were walkable, they were relatively dense, and they allowed for that sort of spontaneous human exchange and interaction that we know leads to more innovation, more ideas, more patents. There are all sorts of studies of the benefits of cities and that sort of spontaneous exchange. It's really only in the last 100 years, with the advent of the automobile, that we went in a very different direction with city planning. And we started mandating a certain amount of parking. We started widening our streets and narrowing our sidewalks. We started zoning for lower density automobile-oriented places. And really, if you think about this sort of spectrum of time, it hasn't taken us all that long to figure out that was a big mistake. In fact, that kind of planning where you forget the individual, where you forget the human being, the pedestrian experience of the landscape, is really a disaster. It's a disaster when it comes to traffic congestion. It's a disaster when it comes to carbon pollution, because transportation is now the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. It's a disaster when it comes to public health, because when people are more sedentary and more locked into automobile-oriented lifestyles, they don't have that opportunity the way people in walkable cities do, just to get a quick 10-minute walk here or a 10-minute walk there that translates into significantly better health outcomes for urban dwellers. And so really it hasn't taken us that long to realize that was a mistake, and you're seeing more and more cities start to reclaim their streets for cycling, walking, and transit, and start to reposition places like the mayor of Paris has done that are going to be only for pedestrians and cyclists, and say it's better for our city to not have cars in certain parts of our city, and a re-emphasis on transit and raising billions and billions of dollars for these transit sales tax measures all around the country. So we're figuring it out, but in the spectrum of city planning, it's really just kind of a return to the basic. So we should put people at the center of city planning, not cars.
That's how do you think we kind of came to get away from that? Did we come to be too enamored with the car, or is there something more fundamental that we kind of lost in that time? Where did we kind of lose the focus on people?
There's been a lot written about the kind of approach of city planning following World War II, which was really, and really intentional government policies, whether it was the investments in the freeways or the mortgage interest tax deduction, which overwhelmingly favored purchase of homes, which were not in the cities, which are outside of cities, there's been a very, very intentional focus on that's really made its way into many of our planning practices on the automobile. And part of the work that we're engaged in now is to kind of dig back into all of these kind of arcane planning policies and programs that really were set up to favor the vehicle and replace those with a focus on people and cities and sustainability.
I am intrigued because a lot of what we've talked about so far has been really focused at this level of governance and, the city mandating certain things. And, we can certainly see where that can have an impact. But I'm intrigued also on the flip side in terms of, private citizens making decisions, or how much of this should be driven, from a business or from a citizen perspective versus coming from above, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, a lot of, I think what we're doing is just responding to the market demand. We partnered with the Urban Land Institute a couple of years ago to do an assessment of how well California's current housing stock meets the demand for what people want in the types of communities they want to live in. And what we found is that so many people want to live near transit. They want to live in walkable communities. They want to have 24-hour communities. They want to have amenities. They want to just be able to walk out of their house and have opportunities to recreate and dine and shop. And that when you compare that desire and demand with the current housing stock, we're really out of balance. So that I think we found that even if we put all new development in the next 30 years near transit, that still would not meet the demand for the number of people who are saying they want to live in communities that provide transit options, that provide access to jobs and 24-hour opportunities. And so it's a pretty strong indication that these are the kinds of places people want to live, but we've got to re-examine our current zoning, because in a lot of places, our local zoning and planning is literally not allowing for the creation of those kind of places that the market is demanding in overwhelming numbers. So this is, I'd say contrary to the idea that there's anything top down, I think this is very much responding to what people are saying they want in their housing choices.
That is really fascinating, and I wonder as well if that goes back to some of the transportation issues in terms of, transportation is obviously an in vogue thing right now, smart growth and these ideas of increasing transit, whether that be bus or whatever that might be. And I know that that's a large part of your work. Is that in some ways because that's an easy target right now because there is a market for that, in the same way that there, I know that we're focused a lot on local food in many places because there seems to be a market for that. Is this on some way riding that crest of energy around that particular topic?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a woman from Ford a number of years ago. She was, I think, like the global head of marketing. And she said that, it used to be that the car, the individual vehicle, was sort of this symbol of mobility and freedom. It's sort of this symbol of coming of age. And people were desperate to get their driver's license when they turned 16 because with the car, you had freedom of mobility, you had independence. And she said, it's not the case anymore. The car is no longer the symbol of freedom and mobility that used to be, because when we think about vehicles, contrary to what any television show, a television commercial for a car will show you, which is like a car driving on a beautiful country road with zero other vehicles on the road, we know that's not the reality in cities. We know that driving means sitting in traffic and frustration and headache. And I think what she said was that what the new symbol of mobility, freedom, and independence is actually the smartphone. Because through the phone, you have this portal to mobility. You can unlock a Ford Go bike here in the Bay Area. You can unlock a bicycle share bike and ride it to your destination. You can figure out when the transit is coming and time your day to be most convenient, so you're not waiting for that train anymore. You can get a lift. You can get a car share vehicle. It's sort of this portal to all of your mobility choices. And she said that was a really interesting reflection on the changing preferences, that young people nowadays would rather have a smartphone than actually own that car because of the changing circumstances.
This brings up some questions for me about that really resonates, and yet on the flip side, I see these people that I think still use that resonance. So here, we're in southwestern Virginia. The city itself of
Uh-huh.
Roanoke doesn't have so many folks that feel this way, perhaps, but there's still a lot of folks around here who view their trucks or their fast cars as as a large part of their identity. And I wonder kind of how is this just a natural thing of us moving beyond that, or is this going to be how do you kind of expand that beyond just those folks that live in cities or live in a certain demographic group?
Yeah. And one of the things we've been looking into is the cost of transportation. So it's not only the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon pollution, it also ends up being the second highest household cost, taking on average about 20% of Americans' household income just to pay for transportation. And with the rise of sort of the sharing economy and the idea of collaborative consumption, there have been a lot of analyses of how often we actually use those cars that that we pay so much money for. And it turns out the average American vehicle sits idle, and this was a shocking number when I first came across it, is idle 95% of the time. It's parked 23 hours a day on average. We only use these vehicles 1 hour a day. So Morgan Stanley has called the private vehicle the most underutilized asset on earth. And yet we spend 20% of our hard-earned money largely owning, operating, insuring, maintaining these vehicles. I think AAA estimates the average cost to own and operate a car per year is about $9,000 per year. And we all know that you never make money on a car, right? It's a terrible investment if you're looking for any kind of return. We all know the adage, you drive off the lot and your car just lost half its value. And so one of the things that's been really interesting to look at is car ownership, does car ownership necessarily make sense economically, financially for people living in cities? Or is there a way to provide that access to that car when you need it without the need for ownership of the vehicle? And I can tell you, actually, I and my family went through this process. We dipped our toe in the sharing economy by sort of sharing our own vehicle. There's a platform in San Francisco called Get Around, where neighbors can share one another's cars. You can, rent a car for $8 an hour or something like that. So we put our car on that platform, allowed other people to use it. And, that was okay, and we made some money off it, but we quickly realized we were the suckers in the deal. We were the ones left maintaining it, reparking it every night, insuring it, when other people got to have the convenience of paying $7 to use it for just that one little trip they needed. And so we eventually flipped over and we sold our car. And now we use Get Around when we need a car, but most of the time we don't need it. My husband bikes to work, I take the bus to work, kids walk to school. Sometimes we'll need it for a weekend trip, and then we'll just pay the little bit of money to rent a car when we need it. And that turns out to just save us a whole lot of money per year. And to be honest, to have no need to constantly think about reparking the car on city streets, it's just one less thing to think about in life.
Oh, I lived in D.C. for a while, and one of our houses had off-street parking, and it was the biggest deal to have a house that had off-street parking, that you didn't have to worry about moving your car around. Oh, I do.
Well, the funny thing we came to realize in our community is the reason it's so hard to park, the reason it was so hard to find a parking space is because most people are not using their car every day. They're just parking it every day and saving it for use on the weekends. And so, I think some companies, there are all these interesting companies that are starting to realize that maybe you're not getting the greatest deal for your money just owning a car. And there's a company out of Helsinki, Finland, that's focused on something called mobility as a service. And what they're thinking is people pay something like $500, $600 a month on their own car. If they could come in with a service, and I think they're pegging their service around $300 a month, a service that you pay $300 a month, it's like a subscription service, not kind of like a cell phone package. And for that service, you would get your transit paid for, you get access to bike sharing, you get X number of Lyft or Uber rides a month, and you get a certain amount of car share rentals on the weekends if you needed it. And they could give you that whole mobility package for less money than it's costing you to own your single car. Maybe that's a deal that some people would find pretty attractive. And then you wouldn't need to have the hassles of parking and car ownership and, the window breaking or the tires needing to be replaced.
Do you think that automated vehicles are going to turn this whole thing on its head here in a few years?
There's been so much talk about autonomous vehicles. Some people kind of joke like there's no major urban challenge that autonomous vehicles won't save. They won't solve because they're sort of seen as this panacea. And I have to say, all of the studies I've seen show that autonomous vehicles could create as many new challenges as they're purported to solve. So one of those ideas is that if we reduce the cost of traveling, the kind of perceived cost in terms of lost productivity and frustration of driving, that maybe people would even drive more. You can check your emails and get work done while in the car. Maybe that would mean new travel would be induced, and then that would be a headache. And some of the estimates are, anywhere from a 60% to a 200% increase in energy consumption and vehicle miles traveled because of autonomous vehicles. So I'm not sold, for one, that autonomous vehicles are going to solve all of our challenges. I think they have some safety benefits, absolutely. But cities are complex places. And the test rides I've taken in autonomous vehicles don't give me any confidence that they're going to be able to negotiate pedestrians, cyclists, kids running out into the street to pick up a ball that went running, animals. We'll get there eventually. I think it's a kind of a long way, and I'm just not convinced that autonomous vehicles are really going to be the panacea everybody seems to think they will be.
It is interesting. One of my colleagues with Expo works for a company called Ride Amigos that helps with ride sharing things for companies. And he was sharing that one of the things that they are a little bit concerned about with autonomous vehicles is how it's going to flip public transportation on its head, and all of this infrastructure that we built for metros and undergrounds and things like that may all be totally subverted by autonomous vehicles in many ways.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the early indicators, we don't have to speculate too much what the impacts of autonomous vehicles are going to be. One of my colleagues kind of joked, what's the best precursor right now of what it's going to be like to ride an autonomous vehicle? And of course, it's like Lyft and Uber, right? Somebody else is driving you around. You're sitting in the back seat and you don't have to do anything. And so it's interesting to look at the impacts of these companies, what we call the transportation network companies, or TNCs, on transit and on cities. And NRDC is engaged in an analysis of these impacts with the University of California at Berkeley, and our study is due out this spring. But even before then, we've seen a couple of studies in the last few months here showing that Lyft and Uber, these on-demand transportation network companies, are increasing traffic congestion. They're competing with and undermining transit choices like subways and buses. And they're creating a whole lot more, cars and pollution in our cities. So if you take away the driver and suddenly the cost of that Lyft or Uber ride plummets, economists would tell us that those effects would get worse. So I think cities are starting to realize that we need to figure out ways to manage these companies and these services to reach our environmental goals, and as opposed to eroding kind of our core sustainable transportation services of transit and walking and biking.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So a big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. It's so interesting because in my mind, there just seem to be endless complications no matter what direction we go. And I wonder, in some ways, if what this is a bigger symptom of is the fact that technology and innovation is happening at a rate that we have really trouble adjusting or even acknowledging what's happening before it's too late and we've already been taken over by the next big thing in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's taken cities a minute to kind of figure out what's happening with Lyft and Uber. There was a kind of a promise that, and I still think there's a thread of that that's still there. There's a promise that Lyft and Uber would mean that nobody would need to own their own car, and that we could use just mobility on demand, and then we could convert all this valuable urban land that is currently dedicated to parking, and we could convert that to more productive uses such as affordable housing or open space, or other kinds of community centers. So that is still a very important policy goal, is to kind of reclaim the land that's currently given over to parking these vehicles that are sitting around 95% of the time unused. And, especially as many of our cities come into affordability challenges, because again, like I said at the top of the call, so many people want to live in cities. Cities are experiencing a resurgence of interest that now, cities are finding they're not providing enough housing for all the people who want to live there. So I think that's still a promise, but whether that promise has really materialized yet in terms of people living without the need to own a car, it doesn't seem like that's happening at scale quite yet.
So much to think about. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about this idea of climate change more broadly, and I think that transportation is obviously a huge part of that, but it's obviously much bigger than that. And I wonder if you could kind of just give us an overview of some of the work that you guys are doing, looking into how climate change is impacting cities these days.
Yeah. So of course, 2017. Showed us a lot of pretty devastating examples of how climate change is already impacting cities. So whether it was the floods in Houston or the wildfires here in California, I think more and more people are coming to realize climate change is it's real and it's already here. Some of the work that we've been looking at in terms of mitigating those impacts. Our stormwater team is looking at how do we reduce stormwater runoff and flooding. And so part of the solution there is to look at something called green infrastructure, which is incorporating more and more green spaces that can serve to kind of capture that rainwater as it falls and prevent that sort of stormwater overflow challenge that so many of our cities see. Additionally, we're looking at the concept of sort of resilience more broadly. And if you think about what happened in Houston, I heard that there were something like 1 million cars were ruined in those floods. And suddenly you have all these people without a vehicle trying to figure out how to navigate their city without a car. And it turns out they haven't done a terrific job of allowing people to get around without a car. And so there's suddenly this focus on, why is our transit system so lacking? Why is it so hard to get around without owning a car? Why have we set up our city that way? And again, it turns out to be one of the sort of resiliency measures we can take. I actually just reviewed the National Climate Assessment, the transportation section of the fourth National Climate Assessment that's come out. And one of the things that they observed is that places that create redundancy in the transportation system, so you can take transit, or you can bike, or you can walk, or you can take a ride share, those are some of the most resilient places when it comes to living through the impacts of climate change. And they talked about New York City and how when Hurricane Sandy came and some of the transit was shut down, well, there were also, because it's a walkable city, that it was also possible to walk. It was also possible to ride the bike share, and there were all these different modes. And that was sort of one of the recommendations that was inherent in that climate assessment, is to make places that don't rely on a single form of transportation, but places where many different options can get you around if we want to create more resilient cities. So that turns out to be both a mitigation and an adaptation, right? You want people to be able to walk and bike and use transit because these all save pollution, but it also, so that mitigates climate change, but it also helps us adapt to some of these increasing storm weather events we're going to be seeing.
This is interesting because I'm, as I hear these different things you're saying, and in some ways it's, they very definitely have to do with climate change, but in some ways they could also, be, could also be things we could do to alleviate poverty or to create more just communities. And I'm wondering, I'm sure that you guys find that you have to kind of walk that line, that sometimes you're using environmental motivators to get this to happen, but sometimes you're using other motivators, aren't you?
Yeah, and I'd highlight one of our projects, which is called the SPARK project. That stands for Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge. And the idea of SPARK is that we're really investing in amplifying local efforts to ensure that major infrastructure investments lead to more equitable and healthy outcomes for everybody. And of course, these infrastructure investments also, they're also a way to look at addressing our climate challenges. But these are really about, people ensuring they have more reasonable commutes, ensuring they have affordable access to get around, and that their communities are also healthy and allow people to lead more healthy lives.
Do you find that that's a difficult message to take to your funders sometimes, that this is, we need to care about the environmental stuff, but we also have to care about the justice side of things? Is that, because it's not always the same people that care about both of those sets of things.
I would say that more, and maybe the opposite, that more and more of the funders engaged in this body of work are interested in social equity and are interested. We've got a program we're calling the High Road Infrastructure Program, and the idea there is that we need to get infrastructure is so expensive that sort of for every dollar we spend, we need to see more returns on the dollar. So this isn't just about building a road to move cars, but that that road has to also allow for safe travel by people on bikes and on foot, and it also has to have the right kinds of materials to be able to handle to reduce the incidence of flooding in the case of storm events. And it also has to beautify the neighborhood and put in street trees, and it also has to help mitigate against urban heat island effect. There's all sorts of different roles or jobs their infrastructure can do, and we're trying to make sure that we get a really strong return in terms of beneficial social outcomes as well as environmental outcomes.
I imagine that really helps when it comes to working in those communities. So from my own experience, there are often times that you go in to a community and they don't want to talk about the things that you think they want to talk about, and they want to talk about something else, which is, we have to listen to that. But I wonder, being able to talk and bring those equity concerns to the table, I'm sure helps you guys both create more comprehensive programming, I imagine, but also develop more community support in some ways.
Yeah, and I would highlight some of the work we've been doing in a community called Watts in Los Angeles. Of course, we celebrated just a few years ago the 50th anniversary, or I shouldn't say celebrated, acknowledged the 50th anniversary of the Watts race riots. And we've been working with some community partners in Watts to really look holistically at that community and how environmental investments can also lead to placemaking and creating a community that is really loved. And so we've been looking really at a lot of different aspects. We've been looking, of course, at transportation, because the Blue Line the Metro Blue Line has a stop that's near this community. But it turns out no one really thought about safe pedestrian access to that transit station. So we've been looking at how to retrofit the streets to make it safer for people to walk and bike to that transit station. We've been looking at how to use green infrastructure investments that will both, mitigate against stormwater runoff, but can also create street greening and street trees and make for more, livable, vibrant, thriving places. And I think we just found out that the state of California, maybe in part because of some of that groundwork we've done, the state of California is going to invest some of their cap and trade revenue funding into the Watts community to help accelerate these kinds of urban greening investments that really are driven from the community from the ground up.
That's so cool. I want,
that program has been called, reimagining Watts. And it's very much been a community-led project.
As I'm listening to you say this, there is this niggling doubt in the back of my mind that, when we look at planetary boundaries, whether those be climate change or whether it be, nitrogen runoff or any of these kinds of things, these are huge issues that require collective solutions. And I wonder, how do you kind of balance that need for collective solutions with the ability and knowledge that you can get work done in smaller communities where that work is much more difficult on a larger level?
Part of the work of our program, of the Healthy People and Thriving Communities program, is to identify best practices that have been created by communities and help to scale them up to multiple communities, sort of accelerating that pace of change. And one of the examples of that work is called the City Energy Project, which takes a cue from a successful program in New York City to retrofit commercial buildings for greater energy efficiency. And we've now scaled up that sort of successful model to 20 cities in the United States that we're partnering with the mayors and the city staff to do commercial building energy efficiency measures. And so I would say that's part of the balance is identifying those local solutions that that have worked in one community and helping to bring those lessons learned to scale in a way that's really commensurate with the scope of the climate challenge that we face.
Well, I imagine that, there are some communities that are much easier to work in than other communities, that there are communities that look for you guys and reach out and want that success, and there are other communities that are a little more reluctant and that you probably have to play a lot harder to get into those communities. Is that something that you guys have found?
The woman who is the director of our program, her name is Shelley Patisha. She's head of the Healthy People and Thriving Communities program. Prior to that, she was with the Obama administration and working for the Housing and Urban Development Department, or HUD, within that administration. And one of the projects she was engaged in was a Sustainable Communities initiative where the federal government gave grants to 143 cities and communities around the country, gave $250 million in grants for sort of sustainability planning efforts. And this really was a cross-cutting effort all across different kinds of communities across the country. And, what they found was that if you talked about sustainable communities, some people resonated with that phrasing and some people didn't. But if you showed a picture of a neighborhood street that had restaurants and shops, and it had street trees, and it had bicycles and people walking and moving around, almost everybody could connect to that image. And then when they explained, this is what we mean by sustainable communities, this is what we mean by thriving communities, it was something that all kinds of people could really connect to and desire for their communities. So I think it's about, it's about finding the connection points, that are going to resonate in different communities. But, it turns out like we don't need to, we don't need to look very far to realize that these are the kinds of places people are really drawn to.
Well, that is interesting. My graduate work was on Tea Party opposition to sustainable development, and so I was researching some of these places where when people would use the word sustainable development, that would totally shut down the conversation. But when you would use something like thriving communities and got those opponents actually engaged, that it was a much more fruitful conversation. And in some ways, it's almost like there are certain things that are almost universal in terms of what people want to see in their communities.
I think that's right. We all want to have opportunities in life. We all want to be able to live healthy lives have access to opportunity. And I think you're right. I think some of these things, these are values that are very near universal. And I think at the local level, in cities, it's sort of maybe easier to move past the, divisiveness of the national climate dialogue. And when you're talking about real places and real investments, there seems to be a little bit more consensus on the kinds of communities we want to build and want to live in.
Kind of building on that in some ways, I wonder, I think you've, I imagine, traveled to a number of communities and seen a bunch of different places, some that are working better than others and some that are thriving and others that are still seeking for ways to thrive more. And I wonder, as you go into a new community or as you're evaluating a new community, what are some of the things that either physically you look for or in the numbers you look for to show you what a community is doing well or not?
It reminds me of a project that we're engaged in right now with the Southern California Association of Governments, which is the 6-county regional transportation planning agency for the greater Los Angeles region. And one of those facts and figures and numbers you were referencing that we've identified is the number of hours that people spend sitting in traffic congestion. And it turns out that in 2016, that number was 104 hours a year, or the equivalent of over 2.5 weeks of vacation time stuck in traffic. And in our mind, that number was really kind of a threshold. And crossing that threshold of 100 hours stuck in traffic, we really thought was quite significant. And so together with TCAG, we've created something called the 100 Hours Campaign. And this is really an effort to look at proven mobility solutions from around the world that could help to break up some of that gridlock in Los Angeles and get people to where they want to go. And so some of those indicators to us that we look at, can tend to point us towards successful programs from around the world to solve those challenges.
Well, I'm intrigued with this because I think that, many of us that don't live in Southern California think that the weather would be nice, but that we couldn't put up with the traffic. Well, obviously there are lots of folks that do. And I wonder, when you survey people that live out there, what do they have to say about the traffic? I imagine they don't like it either.
Yeah, we did some surveys and sort of focus groups, and some of the things we found are that people are really changing their lives because of the traffic. They are sacrificing professional opportunities. They're sacrificing social or even romantic opportunities because they just don't want to sit in that traffic. And so, we've got a little video on the 100 Hours website that talks about kind of all the wonderful amenities of Los Angeles and the Southern California region. But the video asks, what does it matter if we live here if you can't get there? Because we're stuck in traffic. And it's really kind of heartbreaking when you think about the way that people have curtailed life opportunities because that traffic is so bad. So one of the solutions we've been looking at through the 100 Hours campaign is something that we're calling a go zone. An idea of a go zone would be to look at an area of particularly bad traffic. I'd highlight kind of the west side of Los Angeles around the sort of 405 and the 10 intersection. And we found that cars traveling during the peak period in that area are traveling at 3 to 4 miles an hour. So you and I can walk 3 to 4 miles an hour. And New York City is the same thing. Traffic there is moving at less than 5 miles an hour during the peak period. So that's another indicator that something is going a little bit wrong. So in the go zone, we'd be talking about taking an area that's a traffic hotspot, maybe the west side, maybe downtown, who knows, and we'd be looking at significantly increasing transit service. So increasing the frequency, giving dedicated bus lanes so the buses aren't sitting in all that traffic, but if you get on the bus, you're actually able to fly past the traffic, talking about retrofitting streets to make them safer for walking and biking, talking about bringing all sorts of interesting, innovative shared mobility modes, whether it's shared, scooters or bike share or car share or ride share or shuttles, microtransit, all of that. And another aspect of the GO Zone is something we're calling a decongestion fee to make sure that when you want to drive, you could actually get somewhere. And these kinds of programs in London and Stockholm that have been implemented overnight, they've seen 30 to 50% reduction in traffic and in wait times. And so the GO Zone innovation is something we really want to bring to Los Angeles. New York City is talking about it, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland. A lot of cities are starting to realize we need some more tools in the toolbox to manage that traffic congestion and really get people moving again.
Well, it's amazing because as you were discussing this, I can't help but think about, from a perspective of someone who is interested in social capital, you think about all of the opportunities of people to connect with each other that are lost when you're sitting in traffic that long. And you think about economic possibilities, how much economic productivity is lost when these people are sitting in traffic all day long. There's so many different angles that say that this is a terrible waste of all kinds of resources in many ways.
Oh, well, just this week, there was a really astonishing study that came out that found that in 2017, drivers in San Diego, Los Angeles, and the Bay Area collectively spent $17 billion on gas to power their cars. $17 billion. And here's the really crushing part. Almost $7 billion were wasted. Almost 40%. 40% of the money that we're spending on gas is wasted largely because of traffic congestion. You think about that $7 billion that we have wasted collectively, that's per year. And what if that money could instead be plugged into growing our economies, growing jobs, keeping that money in the state? I mean, there's a real economic hardship because of all this traffic and all of this driving. And I think we need to recapture some of that investment, to grow our economy.
Well, as you've kind of engaged with these issues and, whether that be the transportation or the climate issues or any of this kind of stuff, I wonder if you can share something that you kind of learned along the way that was unexpected for you or something that kind of you now go back to and say that I didn't know this before, but it really informs my work these days. Yeah,
I'd say reflecting back on all of the kind of policy discussions I've been involved in, I would say that one of the things I've learned is that, policy change is complex. And that one of the most important things we can try to do really is try to be overly inclusive of different perspectives and stakeholder views when we're crafting new policy solutions. And I think we all have our blind spots. We all have our experiences, and we all have experiences that are unknown to us. And so one of the best ways to hedge against that when we're making new policies is to invite other views to the table. Talk to people that you might not otherwise think of. It is hard. It takes a lot of time. You have to be patient. But if we want to create change that will last, I really think it has to be change that we're all bought into. And that being inclusive of different viewpoints is one of the best ways to do that.
Oh, that's a very powerful lesson. And it is incredibly difficult sometimes, but I think you're right to point out that it's also incredibly rewarding in the long run. Well, I kind of hate to bring us to a close, but I wonder if you could kind of close us out with a story of what you've seen can happen when a community works well or when it really starts to tackle its issues and becomes a thriving community. What does that look like, or what's the story you've seen from a community like that?
Well, I actually wanted to do a little bit of a vision here, because we've got a lot of different goals here. Here we are in 2018. We've got 2020 goals. We've got 2035. Really, 2050 is sort of the ultimate goal that a lot of our climate aspirations look to. And so I wanted to kind of vision out to 2050 and think about a trip. I take a trip all the time down to Southern California to do work with partners down there. And right now what that trip involves is I have to take a lift to the airport, and then I get on a plane, and it burns fossil fuels, and I have to take another ride at the other end, and I end up taking all these car trips and burning all these fossil fuels. And I was thinking, in 2050, what do I want that trip to look like? How do I want to be able to get around the state? And is there a way to do it that really is zero pollution? And what I thought is that I would wake up in the morning and I would walk a block to the electric bike share station that's in my neighborhood. I would get on an electric bike, and with a little bit of an extra boost, I would get downtown San Francisco in 10 minutes. I would climb on a 7 a.m. high-speed train and get my bagel, get my coffee, open up my computer, prepare for my meetings, go through my emails. And then as I'm pulling into Union Station in LA, my smartphone knows where I'm going, knows where my meeting is, knows where I am, and I get a notification of all the transportation choices that exist for me at Union Station. So I can take an electric scooter, I can take an electric bike, I could take transit, and it turns out transit, even in 2050, is still the fastest option going underground, and I would go 3 stops on the red line to my meeting, which is at the Southern California Association of Governments. And I would have crossed the state of California with 0 greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's a vision we could all help to strive for.
Well, that is indeed a very compelling vision, and fingers crossed maybe we can get there. But Amanda, thank you so much for your time. We have to think we can to get there, which I think is perhaps the most important thing, because there's perhaps too many of us that don't think we can. I think is part of the problem. But thank you, Amanda, so much for your time. And I wonder if people are interested in your work, where can they find out more about it?
Oh, well, they could go to nrdc.org, or they could follow me on Twitter. And my handle on Twitter is @Eaken, E-A-K-E-N.
Wonderful. If you guys are interested in more information about CityWorks Expo, you can find us on our website, cityworksxpo.com, or on all your social media platforms. But Amanda, thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you. It was great to talk with you.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.